the 1930s, that when the distribution of wealth gets too far out of whack, the economy needs to be reorganized so the broad middle class has enough buying power to rejuvenate the economy over the long haul. Told you it was going to be pessimistic. A second area of distress, an endemic cycle of violence, is connected to the economy, as will become apparent. The response to the horrible events of 9/11 has resulted in a violent cycle of death and reprisal that continues today. The cycle started when 9/11 was used as a reason to go to war with Iraq. So far, a total of 150,000 Iraqi deaths have been documented since the invasion began, 80% of them civilians. The 400,000 recently revealed Pentagon documents relating to the US invasion and occupation exposes in excruciating detail what many of us feared, that Iraq became a bloodbath of unnecessary killings, civilian slaughter, rape, torture, and people being beaten to death. So far, some 5,000 US troops have been killed in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, with the burden of sacrifice, like our economy, falling unevenly across the spectrum of American society. When America goes to war, it is the poorer and less educated who more often die in combat. This gap is by no means a recent development. All US wars since World War II to the present conform to the classic definition of rich man's war, poor man's fight. Long after the guns and bombs have been silenced, the cycle of violence will continue for our soldiers. Approximately 300,000 current and former service members suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder and depression, and 320,000 have experienced a possible traumatic brain injury. Stressed out, depressed, and dependent soldiers are seeking help for their mental difficulties at a rate that is overwhelming the capacity of available professionals. The suicide rate among veterans aged 20 through 24 is 2 to 4 times higher than civilians the same age. The cost of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan constitute a form of violence in itself. According to Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, it will run to more than $3 trillion. How do we get our heads around $3 trillion? If you counted one number a second, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, it would take almost 85,000 years to get up to 3 trillion. If you were to give $1 million, if you were given $1 million a year to spend, it would take you 3 million years to blow $3 trillion. And now Joseph Stiglitz has recently revised his figure to 4 trillion, noting that the number of veterans seeking care from the VA system since 2001, which is about 600,000, far exceeds his earlier projection. $3 trillion, $4 trillion. And the lion's share of that money isn't going to support our brave soldiers. To illustrate, consider this. While the average Army private's income is $25,942 a year, the average income of CEOs of the top military contractors is over $9 million, with the highest paid CEO, Robert Stevens of Lockheed Martin, making over $24 million. And overbilling the United States government by military contractors is commonplace. So commonplace that it makes the news in little paragraphs in the back pages of the newspaper. The cost of fighting 2 wars hampers our ability to solve other problems, and thus the cycle of violence that was started on 9/11 circles back to our economy and the violence of poverty and inequality here at home. Domestic programs like education and health care for our children were deemed too expensive while we spent $4,563 per second in Iraq. That's $12.3 million for the duration of my speech, if I speak for 45 minutes. The money spent on war each day, is enough to enroll 50,000 children in Head Start for a year or make college affordable to 60,000 low-income students through Pell Grants. It is only by educating and mobilizing Americans that our problems will be solved. An informed citizenry is the bedrock of democracy. This leads me to the third source of distress: a threatened loss of democracy. A politics by bullying is systematically attempting to silence or misinform people. Fear and smear election campaigns repeat blatant lies to get people to act against their own self-interests. The Supreme Court's Citizens United ruling opened the doors for unidentified donors and corporations to flood the airwaves with misleading and dishonest ads. In effect, the rich and corporations can now determine what opinions can be heard. While unlimited campaign spending is a problem, the real threat to democracy is making meaningful discussions about candidates and policies impossible. The premise of the First Amendment is that citizens must be free to speak, not only because this is a fundamental right of human existence, but also because democracy depends on deliberations among reasonable people. In dialogue with others, our presuppositions are challenged. We revise our opinions based on alternative ideas and come to reasoned judgments different from what we would have concluded before. We know it happens in the classroom all the time, right? But corporations do not reason. They are incapable of deliberation and dialogue. Their minds cannot be changed. Their presuppositions cannot be challenged. They cannot enter a town hall and engage in discussion with their fellow citizens. The point is that when the political process becomes nothing more than promoting corporate self-interest, then those with the most money win, and democracy loses. As Bill Moyers recently said, money in politics is a dagger directed at the heart of democracy. In addition to an informed citizenry, another bedrock of democracy is voting. Voting rights sound like such a solid thing. Yet it has been anything but that over the course of our nation's history. In the not too distant past, the right to vote was limited to people who owned land, to white people, to men. And today, the United States is the only democracy in the world that denies people who have done prison time the right to vote, a disproportionate number of them African Americans. Voter suppression, a long and ugly tradition, continues to thrive through the use of an endless variety of obstacles, such as outright intimidation, false notices instructing people to vote on the wrong day or at the wrong place, blocking phone lines used to arrange rides to the polls, making voter registration drives more difficult, using scare tactics to keep poor and minority folks away from the polls, requiring voters to present a voter ID, and not providing enough voting machines, as happened in several states in 2008, where African American voters had to wait in line for hours, while voters in white areas voted easily and quickly. I don't know about you, but the pessimist in me is on full alert right now. I'm way out of whack. We need a joke. I feel like the twins in the joke that was actually a favorite of President Reagan's. There were two 5-year-old twins who had developed extreme personalities. One was a total pessimist, the other a total optimist. Their parents became so concerned about it that they took them to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist met with the pessimistic twin first. Trying to brighten his outlook, he took him to a room piled to the ceiling with brand new toys. But instead of yelping with delight, The little boy burst into tears. "What's the matter?" the psychiatrist asked, baffled. "Don't you want to play with any of the toys?" "Yes," the little boy bawled, "but if I did, I'd only break them." Next, the psychiatrist met with the optimistic twin. Trying to dampen his outlook a bit, he took him to a room piled to the ceiling with horse manure. But instead of wrinkling his nose in disgust, the optimist emitted just the yelp of delight the psychiatrist had hoped to hear from his brother, the pessimist. Then he clambered to the top of the pile, dropped to his knees, and began gleefully digging out scoop after scoop with his bare hands. "What do you think you're doing?" the psychiatrist asked, just as baffled by the optimist as he had been by the pessimist. "With all this manure," the little boy replied, beaming, "there must be a pony in here somewhere." So now we come to the part of my speech where we look for the pony. The hope in all the manure I just laid on you. When faced with the kind of threats that I've described, we have two choices. We can determine that the world is an unjust place, or we can determine that it is a just place and decide that the folks that aren't doing so well must somehow be responsible for their suffering. A belief that the world is just can act as a psychological distortion that encourages support of political agendas focusing on individual effort rather than structural change, like blaming the poor and the unemployed for having an insufficient work ethic. It is when we face the fact that as fragile human beings, we are subject to indifferent and sometimes malevolent forces more powerful than we are, that we can find responsible ways to embrace the realities of vulnerability while working to address the impact of injustice. The point is not to assert that the world is just, but to help make it so. The challenge, of course, is to figure out what to do and how to believe that anything we do will make any difference. The challenge is as much psychological as political. As Paul Loeb says in his book, Soul of a Citizen, quote, "Society has systematically taught us to ignore the ills we see and leave them to others to handle. Understandably, we find it unsettling even to think about the huge crises facing us. We're led to believe that if we can't solve every one of the problems, we shouldn't bother to become socially active at all. Whatever impulses towards involvement we might have, they're dampened by a culture that demeans idealism, enshrines cynicism, and makes us feel naive for caring about our fellow human beings or the planet we inhabit," unquote. As social workers, we know this is called learned helplessness. And the antidote to helplessness is hope. Defiant, resistant, persistent hope. We can find that hope by turning to history, to the stories that teach us to find common solutions by seeing the world clear-eyed and yet acting with courage to make change in spite of the evidence, to believe in spite of the evidence, and then watch the evidence change. Nothing buoys the spirit and fosters hope like the knowledge that others faced equal or greater challenges in the past and continued on to bequeath us a better world. Yet when we turn to history, we need to see it as it really was. We need to be careful not to create myths about our heroes that make it harder for us to act. Let me give you an example. The Rosa Parks story, as popularly told, is that one day she refused to move to the back of the bus, and that started the civil rights movement. The story makes it sound like she acted completely on her own, that she acted kind of unconsciously because her feet were tired, so she just didn't move, and that her action led to instant change. None of this is true. Rosa Parks acted as part of a community. She had been active in the NAACP for 12 years and was the secretary for the local chapter. She went to the Highlander School Civil Rights Center the summer before her arrest, where she strategized and brainstormed with people who had been active before. Rosa Parks didn't make a spur-of-the-moment decision, and her action on that bus was very conscious. She didn't single-handedly give birth to the civil rights efforts. She was part of an existing movement for change at a time when success was far from certain. And many people were involved, often in seemingly insignificant ways. Their stories show us that change is the product of deliberate, incremental action. Sometimes our struggles will fail. Other times they bear modest fruits. And at times they trigger a miraculous outpouring of courage and heart, as happened with Rosa Parks' arrest and all that followed. We get hope from knowing the real stories of courage, not mythical, magical courage like Superman, but the courage of ordinary people who acted despite all their uncertainties and doubts. When people are given a real opportunity to make a difference, they step forward in huge numbers. Progressive groups are connecting online in record numbers. The story of one such group, MoveOn.org, any of you members? All right. That story shows how a small action, when combined with the small actions of many people, can turn into a roar. The day after 9/11, Eli Pariser, I think that's how you pronounce it, was only 20 years old and living in Boston. Fearing that vengeance would bring even greater tragedies, he created a small website that included a petition to President Bush and other world leaders, asking them to use moderation and restraint in responding to the attacks, rather than using the instruments of war, violence, or destruction. Then he emailed the petition to 30 friends. Within days, his inbox was filled with thousands of emails from strangers. His servers started to crash. Within 2 weeks, 515,000 people from 192 countries had signed the petition. Before long, Eli connected with the founders of MoveOn.org, where he is now campaigns director. And Move On has become a major force for progressive change, its membership growing from a few 100,000 to 5.2 million as of 2009.